Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time we went with George Washington from Manhattan to New Jersey, fending off British attacks. Now I will discuss Washington's campaign against the British in New Jersey. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Thank you. By December 1776, Washington was angry at the circumstances surrounding him. He had been forced to fall back and give ground to the British. The states were not putting forward their quota of soldiers. The expiration of enlistments for many of his soldiers were coming up in December, and Congress, out of fear that the British would capture Philadelphia, moved to Baltimore. Washington was tired of running. General Howe and the British Army moved into their winter quarters, with Howe going to New York City. The British general established multiple outposts from Fort Washington down into New Jersey. He would wait until the spring to launch his campaign. Washington needed to launch some kind of strike to boost morale within the rebelling colonies. His headquarters was in a 13-year-old stone farmhouse, and day after day, his field officers arrived to discuss what to do next. One of the men at headquarters, as they were discussing the plans, watched as Washington sat scribbling on a piece of paper. When the man finally saw what the paper said, it read, "Victory or Death." By December 10th, Washington had concocted a plan to attack the small Hessian garrison at Trenton to land a blow to the British and boost the morale of Congress, soldiers, and the American people. On Christmas night, the Continentals assembled at the Delaware River's edge. The general divided his attack force and crossed the river, with a light snowfall turning into sleet. Washington was one of the first to cross the river. He directed the disembarkation of his army, and by 4 a.m. the men and cannons had been unloaded. They now had a 9-mile march to the Hessians at Trenton. A total surprise attack in partial darkness was now out of the question. But he couldn't retreat now. If he did, there would not be another opportunity like this one, because the British would make sure to guard against such an expedition. The Continental Army overpowered the guards leading to the city and attacked the Hessians, forcing many of them to surrender. It was a great victory for Washington, who desperately needed it to instill confidence in Congress and his troops. 20 Hessians were dead, and 919 were taken prisoner. Washington only lost 4 killed and 8 wounded. Part of Washington's divided force didn't get across the Delaware River, and would have made the victory even more spectacular by cutting off the Hessians' retreat. Washington's attack and capture of the force at Trenton caused a chain reaction, and the troops garrisoned at Black Horse and Bordentown retreated. Washington's confidence was up. He now spoke about throwing Howe out of New Jersey. General Cornwallis sallied forth to defeat Washington. The Patriot general assembled his men south of Trenton on a ridge and awaited the approaching British. On January 2, 1777, Cornwallis threw 3 attacks against the American position, but only lost men in the attempt to push the Patriots off the fortified ridge. Darkness covered the battlefield, and now Washington had a choice to make: either stay and fight, retreat, or strike the enemy. Washington would make a daring gamble and decide to strike the British, but stealthily. During the night, Washington left a few men behind to take care of 400 campfires and dig entrenchments that would never be used to convince the British that the Patriots were still on the ridge. All the while, Washington maneuvered his army along the British left flank and moved toward the town of Princeton, led there by Joseph Reed. To keep the wagons and artillery wheels from making so much noise, the wheels were wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. Washington divided his force as they got close to Princeton. One section under Hugh Mercer encountered British soldiers who had left Princeton on their way to Trenton. Positioning his men on a rise behind a fence, he waited for the British to attack. The Redcoats launched a bayonet charge and drove the Continentals away. The commander, Mercer, was bayoneted 7 times and would die the next day. Washington arrived on the scene and rallied the troops, along with bringing up reinforcements. Sometimes riding not 30 yards away from the enemy troops, he brought the routing men to order and drove the Redcoats away from Princeton. Washington captured the town, and another day ended in defeat for the British. A Pennsylvania soldier remembered Washington's actions, writing, "I saw him brave all the dangers of the field, and his important life hanging as it were a single hair, with 1,000 deaths flying around him." With his troops exhausted from the fighting and marching over the last couple of days, the general brought his men to Morristown, New Jersey to rest and recuperate. One of the first things Washington did was order his soldiers inoculated for smallpox, knowing that an army remaining idle in winter quarters would become subject to such an illness. Then he sent out small expeditions to harass the British and force the redcoats to venture further and further away from their camps to get food, wearing down their horses. Small groups of Americans harassed the British troops, resulting in countless small battles. Additionally, the large size of the British Army made supplying all of its troops difficult. More and more, Howe and Cornwallis relied on food from Britain because the countryside didn't yield enough to sustain them. Each year, the British had to personally supply their army with 20 million pounds of bread, flour, and rice. That doesn't include equipment, weapons, ammunition, and feed for horses. Again, for the 1777 campaign season, Washington needed a new army and more troops. One historian described the situation. For the second consecutive year, he faced the task of raising a new army, then training it from scratch. This time, however, there would be a difference. After working closely with Washington, Congress in September 1776 had resolved to reorganize the army. It called for 88 regiments, including 3 in artillery, a 3,000-man cavalry force, and a small corps of engineers. To eliminate the uncertainty of having to recruit a new army at the end of each year, Congress also provided lucrative bounties of cash and land for enlistees. The result was the emergence of a different army. In 1775 to 76, the ranks had been filled chiefly with zealous Republican patriots, men who never doubted that sturdy, virtuous citizens could fight and lick professional soldiers. Howe's campaign in New York demonstrated the folly of such a notion. At the end of the year, these earliest revolutionary soldiers went home and did not come back. In their stead came men who were lured by the promises of money and land. The new soldiers, thus, were drawn from the ranks of America's very poorest inhabitants. Of the 75,000 men Congress had dreamt of, Washington had fewer than 9,000 with him at the dawn of the summer. For the second consecutive year, the militia had seen him through the crisis. For as late as mid-March, 2 of every 3 soldiers in Morristown were militia. A glimmer of hope did come early in 1777 from France. 200 pieces of artillery, 25,000 muskets, along with flint and powder arrived on American shores. Congress promoted the establishment of foundries and arsenals to make munitions and weapons. In mid-June, Howe emerged with his army and began to invade New Jersey overland, marching to the tiny village of Somerset Courthouse. Some of Washington's forces were separated, so he got each section to safety for Howe's next move. Surprisingly, the British Army began to retreat to New Brunswick. Washington sent Nathaniel Greene, Anthony Wayne, and Daniel Morgan to harass the retreating foe, inflicting significant casualties on the British. Washington then came out of his position at Middlebrook to get closer to Howe to act if an opportunity arose, believing he may sail to New York. Howe acted uncharacteristically and went on the attack, sending a column of troops to cut Washington off from Middlebrook. The engagement that resulted delayed the British and allowed Washington to make it to safety back to Middlebrook. Howe, losing any initiative, retreated back to New York. However, Washington would soon learn of the British capture of Fort Ticonderoga without any battle. Washington was confused by the circumstances. He wrote, "The evacuation is an event of chagrin and surprise, not apprehended, nor within the compass of my reasoning." The American commander began to march north with his army, but got news that General Howe's forces were boarding ships in New York. Where would they go, he wondered. Naturally, Washington thought he would go north to link up with General Burgoyne, who captured Fort Ticonderoga. Soon, Washington found that Howe was sailing for Philadelphia and would land troops from the Chesapeake Bay. Washington would send some troops north, then march the rest of his army toward Philadelphia. When they got to the city, Washington marched his men through it on parade. Most congressmen had never seen Washington's army, and the general carefully oversaw even the most minute aspects of the parade. He arranged the organization of the march, ordered the officers to be especially vigilant for any sign of straggling or loafing, had the men wash their clothes and or uniforms and insert a green sprig, emblematic of hope, he said, in their hats, and made it very clear that he did not want any of the female camp followers to be seen with the army from the moment the Continentals entered one side of the town until they exited from the other side. It was a public relations pageant, and a generally successful one at that. The battle for Philadelphia had finally begun, something Washington had expected, since the previous December.